Let's say we had this atheist YouTuber. We'll call him Mr. Secularist. Now, Mr. Secularist specializes in criticizing religious bigotry. But eventually, Mr. Secularist comes across another YouTuber, a Christian who goes by the name of Woman Described. Woman Described puts out anti-LGBT+ and anti-atheist content based on her religious beliefs. Over the coming months, Mr. Secularist produces video after video criticizing Woman Described, creating more than 30 videos. Then, one day, out of the blue, Woman Described puts out a video. In the video, she claims that the criticism levied against her by Mr. Secularist have driven her to the edge. She raises a blood-covered arm and accuses Mr. Secularist of having harassed her to the point of breaking. Now, how do we react to that situation? Was Mr. Secularist in the wrong for criticising what he genuinely saw to be a problem? Should he have not criticised Woman Described since he could have not predicted the way she would respond? Would we apply this standard to the criticism of all people, or just people with a specific set of traits? What if, say, someone like Kirk Cameron made the same claims about all the criticism levied against him? What if he demanded his critics silence themselves for his well-being? What if he did so whilst continuing to propagate an anti-LGBT+/atheist narrative or support those who did? What if Mr. Secularist had only criticised Woman Described a total of 7 times instead of 30+? These are some of the many questions brought up by this hypothetical scenario, and we'll return to them as we discuss the defamation which has been targeted at me this year. But first we need to go over what took place on September the 4th and the days leading up to it. We will also discuss the response of various people who had seemingly been waiting on the sidelines, ready to try and bury me with any passing opportunity. Now, why am I going over all this now? Why not all those weeks ago when the event actually took place? Well, the defamation carried out was severe enough that we involved the law. Since then, we've been working in cooperation with the police to document what occurred. We also sought legal advice from experts working in India, the UK, the US and Australia to ensure that my prior actions and this video are reasonable and justified. Now, all this work took time, especially working with police. As a result, my hands were effectively tied until now, allowing those seeking to defame me a head start. But the truth rises to the top like oil and water, and so here we are. The 4th of September, 1:26 p.m. India Standard Time.
This isn't for the sake of drama. I want a genuine apology, not just for me, but for everyone. Since EOT has me blocked, and I can't tell them how their words hurt me, can someone please send him a screenshot of my thread and see if they apologize this time?
The 4th of September, 5:44 p.m. India Standard Time.
I don't want to post this, but I don't know what else to do. I don't want sympathy. I want Essence of Tweet to be accountable for their actions and realize what they're doing. I need an apology. I'm lost and hurt and angry and sad and confused and terrified. EOT hurt me, and he's hurting others. Maybe not to the same extent, but I don't want to risk that. I can't cope with any more lies and name-calling from him, and I can't risk seeing it happen to other people. Not everyone should watch this video. It might be hard for many. I don't want people to know all this stuff. It's my private stuff. But I don't know how else to get him to leave me alone than to show EOT what he's doing to me. I feel so terrified and weak and out of options, and I don't know what else to do. I'm just drained.
On the 4th of September, popular YouTuber Rachel Oates called on her 100,000 subscribers to actively violate the block I'd put in place to prevent her from contacting me. By her own words, she did so with the explicit intention of making me read her tweets, to in turn force a reaction. As far as forcing a reaction, her plan worked. Less than an hour later, I had posted a thread to my own wall. In that thread, I detailed exactly why I take issue with Oates and shall continue to criticise her for defending an openly violent transphobe whilst simultaneously claiming to be an ally to the trans community. I was angry. Here was a person not only defending a man who seeks to strip me and my fellow trans people of our human rights, but she does so whilst pretending to care for us. When I posted my thread, I thought that was the end of it, that I'd dropped the mic and walked off. So when I found my Twitter feed being overrun by her many fans, hurling all sorts of abuse, including transphobic slurs at me for daring to criticise her, I was a little overwhelmed. Someone claimed that I'd upset Oates with my response to her and told me that she hoped I was happy with what I'd apparently done. Pretty vague insinuations. Eventually I came to discover that Oates had gone on record defaming my character. She was claiming that I'd been harassing her to the point that she was afraid of me. She was also claiming to have taken to self-harm as a result. At that point our Twitter fell silent as myself and Aditya, unsure as to the veracity of these claims, contacted the Metropolitan Police to inform them that Oates was a potential risk to herself. The reason why is very simple. I know nothing about Oates outside of her defence of the violent transphobe, Stephen Woodford. I don't now and have never followed any of her social media pages or watched a single one of her videos. I don't know anything about her backstory, and I don't need to. Nothing justifies defending violent transphobes. Yet another thing I didn't know was whether she lived alone or with others. Therefore we did all we could to ensure her safety. After which we stopped responding, waiting 24 hours before posting our public statement on advice of the police. After contacting the Metropolitan Police, we contacted our local Indian police to detail the transphobic harassment, including death threats, that we started receiving from Oates' fanbase. You see, even though the fact that Oates thought to provoke a response whilst we had her blocked was publicly available, people bought into her dishonest claim that I'd been harassing her. Part of me understands that. We see someone crying, someone we formed a parasocial relationship with, and that impacts us. We feel angry, we feel the desire to reach out and to help them, to make the person responsible suffer. I get that. That is every day of my life when I read the statistics as to what's happening to trans people day after day. So I want to be clear. I'm not here to undermine your emotional response. I'm here to provide evidence that shows what actually took place and demonstrate how your good nature has been manipulated by Oates and numerous other people. Starting with the facts that someone who is genuinely afraid and is doing everything they can to stop someone talking to them would not violate Twitter safety features to provoke a response from said person. Something one might expect such a person to do is block the individual they're afraid of. Yet Oates never once did that. As far as I'm aware, she didn't have me blocked until after myself and Aditya posted our statement noting that the police were now involved. What's more is, this is pattern behaviour. When fellow YouTuber Rhetoric and Discourse was critical of her in a thread a couple weeks after all this had happened, she demanded that he stop, to which he responded by telling her to block him if she felt uncomfortable seeing what he was saying in a conversation with other people. Her response? She outright refused to do so, ordering him to stop criticising her once more. What this displays is that Rachel Oates not only rejects any and all responsibility for handling her own comfort, she genuinely believes that if she wants you to stop criticising her, then it's the responsibility of her critics to self-censor. Now could you imagine if, to go back to my earlier example at the start, Kirk Cameron or Kent Hovind made the exact same sort of insistence? How long before that expectation is laughed out of there? So why then is it treated as reasonable with Rachel Oates? When she did everything she could to circumvent my block to provoke me, I had no reason to suspect that she would respond the way she did to some criticism. None at all. There was absolutely nothing about a person who, the only way I can describe it, was harassing me, which suggested a single response from me would drive them to self-harm. So whatever people seem to expect me to have done, that standard needs to be applied to all cases where we don't know how a person will react. Which is interesting considering that the people making the claim that my response to Oates' violation of my privacy to provoke me crosses some moral line have built their careers on the exact same thing. You can replace Oates with any other person, including religious bigots, and the expectation of the people criticizing them has to be the same as that expected of me when criticizing Rachel Oates. Because here's another fact that Oates seems to ignore. She's a public figure. She's a silver plaque YouTuber, meaning she has over 100,000 subscribers compared to my 30,000. She is in the public eye. She has a large platform, and what she does with that platform is fair game as far as criticism goes. As for what my supposed harassment entailed, how about we take a quick look? I responded to Oates' public tweets twice, mentioned her in passing in a single video, and created a Facebook post back in May. Now, the tweets I responded to were part of a thread in which she shared confidential material taken from a mental health support group, a group set up by some of the victims of Stephen Woodford's transphobia. Back then, it was a safe place for people who had suffered as a result of Woodford's actions to discuss their problems and gain support. We had multiple discussions detailing how the transphobic, racist, homophobic, and ableist abuse Woodford had emboldened in his audience had impacted things such as sleep. There were also conversations discussing suicide. Oates published materials from this private group seeking to cast Woodford's victims as the real bad guys for daring to try and take care of one another. And she was never held responsible for violating basic ethics when it comes to mental health support. None of the people claiming to be advocates for mental health all of a sudden said a word back then. As for my Facebook post, it was me detailing why I had no intention of responding to her any further at that time. I had to create the post after Rachel and her friends attempted to prolong personal drama, not relevant to the actual issue at hand, which was the human rights of trans people. By that point, I'd also blocked her. Something to keep in mind in relation to her claims that she was the one who walked away from the conversation back in May. That is demonstrably false, and as we can all see, I have the receipts to prove it. I then responded twice more to her public tweets in September before blocking her again after growing tired of dealing with her defenders. I came across her thread defending Woodford when a couple of the people I followed were criticizing Oates' double standard and seeing the danger inherent with theists who present as friendly faces whilst calling for the removal of LGBT+ rights, but failing to see the issue with Woodford doing the exact same thing. This whole idea of making bigotry palatable. Finally, we come to the thread I made in response to her calling upon her fans to violate my block in hopes of forcing a response from me. If we include that provoked response, that means I've contacted Oates or mentioned her in any way in my work, a total of 7 times spanning 5 months. For comparison, YouTuber Mr. Atheist has created more than 30 videos responding to Girl Defined. And I'm not on about mentioning her in passing or responding to tweets. I'm on about videos which focus on and even mention her in the title. Yet apparently that's not harassment, whilst my 4 response tweets, a passing video mention, a single Facebook post, and a provoked response are. I do wonder if Girl Defined were to come up with a video like Oates had. Reminder that Oates had given me no reason to suspect my criticism would have that reaction. Would Mr. Atheist receive the same sort of threats and abuse I have been receiving from all those people who claim to stand with Rachel Oates? I guess we'll never know. What we do know is that responding to a public figure 7 times over 5 months does not constitute harassment. Harassment would be something like violating a block someone has put in place to make sure they saw your messages. That's even though they've made very clear that they're not interested by blocking you. Now, the last aspect I like to discuss in this section is pretty dark. But when the prospect of self-harm enters the picture, it's something that needs to be covered. I don't know what happened on the 4th of September. All I have to work with is a video in which a crying woman raised her arm to show what appears to be blood on it. Everything beyond that is pure speculation. I don't know what she was thinking at the time. I merely wrote a public response to her calling on her fans to violate my block of her. Yet she says she became so distraught by that she cut herself before turning on a camera in which she told me to look at what I'd made her do. This video was then rendered, uploaded, given a title and description, and then posted as part of a thread in which she once again told people to send it to me, all within 4 hours of my response. Fact is, this isn't the first time self-harm has been discussed in relation to the conversation. 2 days earlier, on the 2nd of September, Oates has stated, quote,
"But now all they want to do is cause outrage. They're systematically trying to ruin careers, and they're actively manipulating their audience, and worst of all, in my opinion, they're using self-harm as a shield to excuse crappy behavior, which minimizes how difficult the struggle is and how harmful it can be for the rest of us. Therefore, screw him and anything he says about me."
Again, the whole screw him and anything he says about me doesn't exactly give the impression that she was being traumatized by my criticism. In the 48 hours before she claimed to be terrified of what I was saying, Oates was actively stating that she didn't give a damn and violating my block of her to provoke a response. But what is she on about in regards to me using self-harm as a shield? Well, she's talking about the facts I very clearly stated self-harm was not on the table for me. Now, if that confuses you, you're not alone. I was responding to one of Oates' close friends, namely American YouTuber Thomas Westbrook, more commonly known as Holy Kool-Aid. Westbrook had defended a self-identified transphobe's month-long abuse of me as part of some twisted job interview. I should declare that Westbrook had received hundreds of dollars in donations from this person, a fact Westbrook becomes very aggressive about when confronted with. Again, I noted right off the bat that self-harm was not on the table for me. However, neither Westbrook nor the bigot in question knew this at the time. All they did know was that I belonged to a demographic with high rates of attempted suicide. This is not me telling them that if they continue to abuse me, I will commit suicide. It was me telling them that if they continue to do this with other trans people, that is a very likely result. Oh, I don't know. How about this, Westbrook? As a member of a marginalized community with high levels of attempted suicide, I did not sign up to be abused. All it takes is one bigot too many and it's lights out, permanently. Thankfully, self-harm hasn't been in my books for a long fucking time. I tend to respond to things that make me feel powerless and wronged with incredible amounts of aggression. Which is not nice, but it's preferable to where the other road leads. I'm still recovering from a triple infection because my immune system has been shot to pieces through the constant stress I've been experiencing. But the fact remains, you didn't know any of this. Friedel didn't know any of this. All you did know is that I am a member of a marginalized community with high levels of attempted suicide, already suffering extortionate levels of transphobic abuse. So you decide to add more. Well, what gave either of you that right? You're fucking lucky I respond to shit like I do. Because if I'd gone the other way, well, I guess my absence would have been much more convenient for yourself and your crew. If I really was going to try and hide behind self-harm as Oates claims I was, since she has repeated this claim in her official statement, the last thing I would do is tell my abusers that self-harm was not on the table for me. So the level of gaslighting Oates has to resort to in order to change what I actually said, and she even quoted, seems to suggest that this tweet and her subsequent statement shows more about her and how she sees self-harm than it does me. That's her projection, conscious or subconscious, on what she did. So in closing this section, did I harass Rachel Oates? No. I criticised a public figure for repeatedly defending the violent transphobe, Stephen Woodford. I have no knowledge about her apparent history of self-harm or extreme reactions. My only connection with her being her defense of Stephen Woodford, and that alone. She not only failed to use the block feature, but actually went so far as to violate Twitter's terms of service to bypass my block of her to provoke a response. As a public figure, Oates does not have the right to support an openly violent transphobe who remains unapologetic about said stance whilst declaring herself an ally to trans people. Only to use false accusations of harassment to silence whichever trans person is critical of this hypocrisy. And if you want to claim otherwise, That is a standard you have to apply to all YouTubers, including Oates herself. When you go out of your way to circumvent someone's block of you and send them messages they've clearly demonstrated that they do not want to receive by blocking you, you can't reasonably expect that to end well and blame the other person when it doesn't. She could say whatever the hell she liked about me whilst I had her blocked. I don't believe I have this magical right to silence my critics for their criticism. There's a YouTuber out there, we'll call him Rotten Peach. I've had Rotten Peach blocked for years due to his dishonest approach to my content. Yet throughout all of this, he has been creating videos lying about both myself and the science to try and get at me. Now, do I refer to that as harassment? Do I call for his channel to be flagged since he continues to talk about me, even though I have him blocked? No, because that's unreasonable. Even at 30,000 subscribers, I am still a public figure who puts out public content. What I do count as harassment is him listing reasons as to why he thinks I'm not really transgender, because there's absolutely no point to that outside of seeking to hurt me. Just so you know, this person is one of the many people Rachel Oates has personally thanked for how they rushed to her assistance when she grew tired of being held accountable for her continued actions. Oates, the self-declared trans ally, accepted the support of someone who very openly undermines the identities of trans people as a means of attack. Now, I say continued actions for one very important reason. As much as Oates claims to have removed herself from the conversation, the only reason I responded to her in September was because I found someone I did follow, criticising her continued defence of violent transphobe Stephen Woodford. My criticism was not unprovoked, it was not out of the blue. It was brought about by her continued actions in undermining the anguish her friend had inflicted and seeks to continue to inflict on the trans community. Had she not done that, had she just not defended a violent transphobe, well, we wouldn't be here. What is violence? Oh, well, that's rather easy. That's when a person physically assaults another person. Isn't it? Well, say we have a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, Mr. Smith is a little different. He's a stay-at-home father, looking after 3 children whilst Mrs. Smith goes off to work. Over time, however, Mrs. Smith starts doing something. She starts withholding access to the family finances from Mr. Smith, not allowing him to purchase anything, not even necessities like food, bathroom supplies, and cleaning products without her permission. Eventually, this grows to the point that Mrs. Smith is limiting who Mr. Smith can go out and see, effectively severing their connection to family and friends. If Mr. Smith ever raises an issue with the way that Mrs. Smith's treatment is depriving not just him but the rest of the family their basic needs, Mrs. Smith threatens him with even more severe financial restrictions. What I'm describing is known as economic violence, a very real and legally recognized form of violence seen in both industrial and domestic settings. You see, violence is defined as the following by the World Health Organization. Quote, the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. End quote. Now, with economic violence and domestic abuse, that is the usage of economic power one partner has over the other to control them, something which harms them through stripping them of their autonomy and depriving them of necessities. But economic power is not the only form of power. Another form of power is legislative power. Let's talk abortion access. When the Christian right seeks to outlaw abortion access, that is the use of legislative power to harm cis women, trans men, and non-binary folk with a uteri. It's true that some people are against abortion not as a means to hurt these people, but because they have a misguided perspective on abortion and bodily autonomy. However, it's undeniable that there are people out there, especially Christian men, who do weaponize abortion bans as a means to harm and subjugate, in their eyes, women. All because they believe it reinforces a woman's place in society and that childbirth is a woman's punishment for the sins of Eve. Those people are using legislative violence. Now, when I first responded to Stephen Woodford, I didn't know why he created a thoroughly transphobic video. I didn't know whether it was due to transphobia within him or simply transignorance. Therefore, I wasn't happy labelling his words a call to violence. Hell, I didn't even label him as transphobic in a video until my 6th video response, published on the 22nd of June. What I did do, however, was open my video listing the human rights which would be violated if we did as Woodford called for and excluded trans women from women's sports. This was my opening point, a point I raised in every subsequent response. This was not drama like those who seek to trivialize what took place claim. This whole thing from the very start has been a human rights issue. Now I know what's coming. How can this be a human rights issue? It's just sports. Sure, it's just sports, in the exact same way that was just a marathon, just a bus, or just a water fountain. When you take a single snippet of the wider picture and boil it all down to just one aspect, you can make pretty much any human rights movement seem ridiculous. The human rights violated when you exclude trans women from women's sports are, quote, the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to sexual and reproductive health, the right to work and to the enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work, the right to privacy, the right to freedom from torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and full respect for the dignity, bodily integrity and bodily autonomy of the person. End quote. Note that this list comes from the United Nations Human Rights Council's discussion on how the rights of intersex cis women are violated when excluded from sports. Trans women face much the same gatekeeping, including the medical aspects which violate right to privacy. There's also the fact that in order to compete under the current conditions in certain places, trans people have to sterilize themselves. Now, sports is important, and the United Nations Human Rights Council recognized this in acknowledging, quote, the potential value of sport as a universal language that contributes to educating people on the values of respect, dignity, diversity, equality, tolerance, and fairness, and as a means to combat all forms of discrimination and to promote social inclusion for all. End quote. When you exclude trans women from women's sports, you're not simply violating numerous human rights. You are designating them as not real women, as an invasive force coming to take what doesn't belong to them. You are cultivating future transphobic violence. But again, at the start, I didn't know whether or not this was intentional on Woodford's behalf. In the months that followed, however, Woodford made very clear that it was. That he not only sought to harm trans people, but still stands by his calls to legislative violence against us. Ergo, he is a violent transphobe. Now, by the first time I came into contact with Oates in May, that was already becoming clear. But by the time I came across her tweets defending him in September, he had created his corrected video in which he just doubled down on his calls to violence. That's why there was a difference in my tone when I responded to Oates in September when compared to May. She was claiming that Woodford, in the 6 months he'd had to change his perspective, just hadn't been given enough time. I mean, people outright ignore the fact that from the posting of my first video in April up to his ACA video in May, I had given him a wide berth to put right the damage he was causing the trans community. And yet he did nothing. Only when I brought back the heat after he'd been criticised by the ACA, after he thought he might actually lose money because of his actions, did he start doing what I told him he should have been doing from the very beginning. Sadly, that was short-lived as the ACA president overruled the ACA board and retracted the board's statement shortly before Woodford's personal friend Thomas Westbrook led a McCarthy-style coup of the ACA board, violating charity bylaw to elect some of Woodford's personal friends to said board. Woodford's friends, the many who have rushed forward to partake in Oates' defamation of my character, also showed him that there would be no accountability for his actions, that they'd continue to defend him no matter how much he harmed the trans community. So he lost even the selfish incentive to do the right thing, instead doubling down on the violent transphobia which has been very profitable for him. Not so much for everyone trying to actually do the right thing. Now, his friends claim that they're the ones who actually got him to start fixing things. But here's the problem with that narrative. Why then did it stop? You lot haven't stopped defending Woodford, but the moment the ACA buckled and you lot rushed forward to defend him, the attempts to pretend like he had changed stopped altogether. What you claim and what we observe are two very different things. So now that we've gone over the facts that the claims that I harassed Rachel Oates lack all merit and exactly what I mean by violent transphobia, this opens up more questions about the secular community and why so many large names responded the way they did. Why do they ignore the fact that I had Oates blocked? Why do they ignore the fact that she violated that block to provoke my response? Sadly, there's a great deal of hypocrisy in the secular community. Right off the bat, we have the difference in how I was treated versus how Woodford was. Woodford was called out immediately by numerous trans people as having caused them and the trans community in general a lot of harm. Yet many of the people associated with Woodford did nothing for months. Meanwhile, the moment Oates set out to defame my character, they couldn't mobilize fast enough. Perhaps the best example of all of this is Mr. Atheist, who hadn't said shit to try and help the trans community, becoming rather aggressive when this fact and subsequent tone policing of trans voices was brought into question. But when Oates put out false accusations of harassment, he rushed out 3 watery videos on events prior, saying little to nothing of any actual value, giving Woodford a minor slap on the wrist for his continued calls to violence against the trans community, just so he could present his 4th and final video as being remotely balanced. And this is a common theme. A lot of the people who rushed to Oates and supported her in her act of defamation claim to support the trans community. Yet when one of those trans people criticizes a member of their little clique, they all set out to try and silence that critic. Because, let's be honest, this isn't the first time this has happened to me. Back in May, another one of Oates' close and personal friends, Telltale Atheist, began publicly claiming that I'd instigated violence at the Faithless Forum 2019 through my criticism of Stephen Woodford. For those who don't know, the Faithless Forum is a small conference founded by a couple of YouTubers belonging to the same clique as Oates. One of the founders and primary organisers is Thomas Westbrook, the man who tried to defend a person who declared themselves more than simply transphobic, because they'd paid him hundreds of dollars. Westbrook also led the ACA coup. Another one of the official organisers was Telltale Atheist. So Telltale went around claiming that I'd instigated violence at the Faithless Forum. He even went so far as to compare the level of violence which took place to the burning down of Kingdom Halls, claiming that everything had been caught on camera. Of course, the footage never surfaced and no other people came forward to support his accusations. So, how was Telltale held accountable by the rest of the Faithless Forum organisers? What was done about his clear criminal defamation? Nothing, of course. He was given a free pass by Westbrook and the others. He didn't even offer me a genuine apology. He said sorry, only to explicitly state that he'd done so, not because he was sorry, but to move the conversation away from his defamation in the same thread. And still they were silent, because this was a failed attempt to stop my criticism of the transphobic elements in the secular community. One of many. Only the day before Oates set out to defame me, the exact same thing happened again. This time, instead of calls to violence, I'd apparently made calls to suicide. In responding to Lizzie Lang, one of Woodford's earliest defenders, I told her to leave Woodford's Church of Transphobia. From the context of the tweet itself and the tweets prior, that was pretty obvious. Now, when I went to sleep, I didn't know there was an issue. Then, overnight, my feed suddenly blew up. Yet, whilst I was asleep, people were already pointing out the clear context of the line taken to mean suicide and how it was obviously a reference to leaving the Church of Transphobia. No input required on my part due to how obvious it was. When I woke up on the 3rd of September, it took me a while to gather what had happened. I posted a clarification thread noting the context of the word and how some people were clearly looking to use it to defame me. However, when I discovered that there were some people who seemed to have been genuinely hurt by my words. I apologised for the harm my words had caused and promised to do better in the future. And by the end of the day, the whole thing had pretty much died down. I survived another attempt by the clique Oates is part of to defame me. Then the fourth happened, and all of a sudden a tweet telling Lizzie Lang to leave Woodford's Church of Transphobia magically transformed into a tweet telling Rachel Oates to commit suicide. And no, that's not a joke. People genuinely believe that tweet to Lizzie Lang was the tweet that pushed Rachel Oates to self-harm. Now I don't know where they got this idea from, but that's a symptom of just how uncritical some people are being when it comes to accepting the word of people trying to defame me. So why is this happening? Why do we have a group of large YouTube secularists uniting to sink a much smaller channel? Well, it seems to be because they view me as a threat. I'm not someone who can ever be bought or bullied. I refuse to be their trans token and I refuse to be silenced. I'm someone who will call them out on their transphobic shit when I see it. I am to them a loose cannon, a secular watchdog. They also can't deal with my arguments. That much has been made very transparent these past few months. So what are they left with? Well, they can seek to destroy any and all credibility associated with the channel's name. And that seems to be the strategy they're taking. Ocean went so far as to use the transphobic abuse myself and Aditya were receiving as a means of extortion, laying out plainly that I was to never supply the evidence of what actually took place once the police had done their work, preventing the truth from ever being heard. Ocean seemed to be hoping to secure a situation in which only the defamers were allowed to speak. Not that surprising considering how easy it was to prove him wrong on many of his claims a couple of days before this. He made several claims I refuted with screenshots, and I didn't hear a word from him. No apology, not even when I tagged him once again. But he was very quick to demand I never defend myself from Oates' defamation. But let's just consider what actually happened here. I criticised Oates for defending a violent transphobe, in effect defending myself and all other trans people by fighting for our human rights. That was wrong. Everyone else turns their audiences towards me, partaking in active defamation to stir up an abusive mob to try and target me for that very reason. That's okay. The raw hypocrisy on display here is amazing. Criticism of people who defend violent transphobes is off limits. Abuse of trans people defending their very human rights is fair game. That is the message every single one of the creators who rush to partake in Oates' defamation is sending out. Unlike many in the comments, these creators know that Oates had baited me. They know I had her blocked. They know I'd only mentioned her a handful of times. But they chose to go with the lie that personally benefited each of them, rather than stand for what was true and what was right. No nuance, no self-reflection on how their response to me far surpassed what I'd done. Nothing. Because as much as many of them pretend they're fine with trans people or anti-bullying, those are just bumper stickers to get more clicks and to deflect criticism from the trans community over their harassment of its members. They don't give a crap about the damage they've caused. Hell, many of them seem to revel in it. Stephen Woodford, the violent transphobe who began all of this, who is responsible for everything that has occurred these past 6 months, knew what he was doing when he made his recent video covering Oates. I know he knows because he did a field test with the atheist community of Austin back in May. Back then, he told his audience not to abuse the ACA moderators, seemingly to give himself plausible deniability as they swarmed every ACA social media page and did just that. The level of racist, sexist, homophobic, and of course, transphobic abuse the moderators had to deal with resulted in the entire team walking out. Many had to seek psychiatrists to help them repair the damage inflicted on them by Woodford. So when he created his video aiming the exact same audience at me, once again taking the path of plausible deniability, he knew that his audience would ignore this request, He knew I'd start receiving such a large volume of transphobic abuse that would make it difficult to cope with. The same audience broke the moderation team of an organized charity. I am one person. That's when the death threats started to become more blatant. That's when the attacks became more focused on my trans status. Woodford has cultivated a very abusive audience, and he's figured out how to wield them. And it's a sad day to see this become an accepted part of the secular community. But that's what a lack of accountability has brought us. I just wanted to open this section by noting the fact that this is not intended to sway your opinion in either direction when it comes to whether what I did was right or wrong. If there's anything the recent events surrounding the trial of Amber Geiger has shown us, it's that crying and talking about how your actions have impacted you does not necessitate those actions were moral. The only thing that has any merit in regards to that are the actions themselves. Was I justified in criticising Oates for defending a violent transphobe? Was my response to her violation of my block unreasonable? So, if that's all you're here for, then I suggest skipping to the next section. I hope you think about the evidence presented here and alter your views in light of it, where necessary. But a lot of people have been reaching out to both myself and Aditya, concerned about what has transpired and what the true cost of Oates' defamation has been. The easiest part to quantify are the metrics, so let's start with them. Following Oates' defamation and the subsequent fallout, our channel has lost more than 800 subscribers, a rather sizable dent when you consider the fact that the people who unsubscribe are likely to be amongst the most active when it comes to video interaction. We've also lost more than $160 in Patreon sponsorship. That's net loss, by the way. Not all of which has been the result of Oates' defamation, but certainly a large part of it was. This is compounded by the fact that myself and Aditya only just moved, and we're now seeing a professional counsellor to help us with the abuse we faced the past 6 months. Because people very often don't understand the sheer volume of the abuse. Following Oates' defamation in the hours that followed shortly, I'd manually blocked more than 500 accounts for abusive tweets. We of course set our Twitter to protected when the influx became too much to deal with. Similarly, we changed YouTube comments to reviews since transphobic posts would be started, would attract people with the same feather, people who were then going to start their own transphobic posts if the original was removed. By moderating comments before they were published, we were able to avoid this. On Facebook, we temporarily turned off messaging because that quickly became a popular venue for the abuse and threats we received. Speaking of threats, we received a wide range of threats, from ones talking about writing articles about us in newspapers if we didn't respond, all the way to several death threats. All threats have been handed to the police for further investigation. Which is another way what occurred has cost both myself and Aditya. The time and energy spent filing multiple police reports and maintaining contact with both the Indian police and the Metropolitan Police, whilst also talking to various legal experts on 4 separate continents. But that's all pretty basic stuff. The true cost of both myself and Aditya has been psychological. Before Oates' defamation, we were already seeking mental health support for the abuse Stephen Woodford had brought upon us. Aditya had already tracked down an LGBT+ inclusive counsellor in Delhi. We were just waiting on account of the fact that we needed to save money for our wedding, for my visa, and for the move to our new home. So we were pretty open when Oates carried out her attempts to defame me, and the rest of the clique she belonged to targeted their audiences at us. Aditya took things very hard. We're very close as a couple due to our shared childhood experiences, and we do our best to support one another, and that's what she tried to do. She kept reading what people were saying because she felt like she needed to be there to defend me, and all it was doing was tearing her apart to see the threats and the transphobic abuse. So in the end, I asked her to stop reading the messages we were receiving. I went so far at one point to suggest that we remove her as admin from the Facebook page, but then I figured out how to turn messages off. It really dragged her to a bad place. She would spontaneously break down whether she was at home or at work. She had to have some crisis counselling whilst We talked to a friend who had loaned us some money for the move to ask if it was okay to pay them in smaller installments over a longer period of time so we could go and start seeing the counsellor. A couple of months later, and she's starting to do better. Her new job is amazing. The new house is located somewhere she can walk around. She's been eating a lot of her cultural food recently with Diwali. In all, she's on the mend. As for me, it's complicated. The abuse itself doesn't get to me anymore. I'm a YouTuber who has been openly and visibly trans for several years. Constant abuse is sadly an established fact of my existence by this point. What really got me was not being able to put the evidence covered in this video in one central place whilst the investigation were in an early state. Seeing large secular YouTubers post defamative video after defamative video, actively propagating a fictional narrative of what took place on the 4th of September and the months leading up to it, was infuriating. It's truly eye-opening to see the actions of some of the people in the secular community. Worst of all, however, was the way that the sheer volume of the lies started to eat away at my own thoughts. I remember waking up each day and checking Twitter's advanced search feature to see if I'd only responded to Oates' tweets 4 times as I remembered. You see, I became afraid that what I remembered of the evidence was an actual memory but a dream from the night before. That I'd invented the baiting or the number of times I'd responded to Oates as a means to justify what had happened to myself. I found myself reading through the full police report each night to focus on what I could demonstrate occurred. And sometimes it still wasn't enough. Sometimes I'd start to think that they were right, that I hadn't been baited, that I hadn't blocked Rachel Oates, that I'd harassed her every day for the past 5 months. Abuse begets abuse. In my video, Bible Illustrated Gets Atheism Very Wrong, I commented on how many abusers were once themselves abused, that people who have been abused are, statistically speaking, more likely to become abusers themselves. I mentioned how, for survivors of abuse, this fact is like a black mark you carry with you for the rest of your life, afraid you'll become the very thing that hurt you. Some of you out there caught on to the fact that I was talking about this from a very personal perspective. I was a victim of both domestic abuse and rape as a child, and this is one of the many ways that impacts me and my perception. Anytime I get angry, I become afraid that I'm hurtling down a slope, becoming something much darker. That's the paradox of my relationship with anger. On one hand, I tell others, especially trans people, to own their anger, use it as a motivator, and never let society strip you of said emotion to police the very things that make you human. Yet all too often I find it very hard to take my own advice. Anyone who has watched my channel for a while knows I often apologize for sounding aggressive in videos where I barely raise my voice. I plan to discuss this in further detail as part of my mental health awareness series, detailing my experiences of coming to terms with the facts that I had been abused and what had occurred, but I never quite found the right tone for it at the time, so the third video, which would have covered the conditions I developed and the ways I was trying to manage them, was never completed. So to have hundreds, if not thousands of people feed directly into that fear, that really clawed at my psyche. Thankfully, it's now one of the things I'm receiving help for from my counsellor, and that's where we are right now. We're steadily trying to fix the damage Oates' defamation has caused us. I don't know what the future holds. I imagine some people won't give this video a chance, but will instead take its very existence to validate the narrative they've been fed by bad actors. Yet I know one thing. I cannot let such falsehoods pass without challenge, to say nothing, to let the liars dominate the narrative. So if you're one of the people who has listened to what I've had to say, thank you. I know it's very easy to write me off in the current climate. so I thank you for giving me the time, if nothing else. As for Rachel Oates, I do hope she gets whatever help she needs. But that fact does not excuse what she did in setting out to defame me, seemingly as a means to silence a critic. I hope that in time and with support present, she realizes the severity of what she has done. Just how much damage she has caused not just me, but the trans community through her active defamation. The feminist appropriators have already begun using said defamation to further their narrative of dangerous trans people to justify excluding trans women from women's spaces. Because, as I stated repeatedly throughout all of this, I'm expected to act a saint when people call for the removal of my human rights. Even Kent Hovind got in on the action to try and present this as an issue inherent with atheism. Yes, that actually happened. And in an odd sort of way, I would agree with him. When cliques like the one Oates belongs to form and its members are spared all scrutiny, this will continue to happen, as it has for the past decade. What transpired has sent out a message to all future trans voices in and around the secular community. They've been told that if they dare to criticize people defending violent transphobes, that they should expect extraordinary levels of transphobic abuse, all with a seal of approval of self-declared trans allies. And that's just soul-crushing. Yet it doesn't have to be that way. We can do better. We can hold bigots accountable for their actions. And if we're going to do that, we can't let the same people silence their critics. People like Oates, Woodford, and Westbrook have to be willing to reflect on their actions and listen to the voices they've harmed. They can't be allowed to dismiss a human rights issue as drama or criticism as harassment. They, Oates in particular, also need to learn how to respect the fact that if someone has them blocked, they have them blocked for a reason. Now, that doesn't mean they can't criticize that person. That doesn't mean they have to stop talking about them. But if they openly circumvent that block to provoke their target, that is genuine harassment. And they shouldn't be allowed to demand a polite response when they set about doing that. Certainly not when they set out to do it to a marginalized person defending their human rights each and every day. Unlike Oates, who can turn off her computer and walk away, I can't. My rights are in question wherever I go. And the misinformation still being put out there by Stephen Woodford, along with his calls to violence against me, are having an impact. Speaking of violating people's blocks, we had another display of this whilst I've been waiting for the police to give me the green light to go ahead and publish this video. Namely, one of Oates' supporters, another person she has personally thanked for said support, went ahead and made a rape threat against Chrissy of Chrissyosity. Now, because Chrissy had both of their 2 Twitter accounts blocked, they had to ask one of their friends to make the rape threat for them. At first, I genuinely wondered if they had actually told them to do this or if it was just someone saying shit to stir the pot. However, that person has made very clear that they were the source of the rape threat. So to be clear, this is a current standard. Me clapping back when someone calls to their fans to violate my block of them, detailing the very serious reasons I take issues with them claiming to be a trans ally whilst defending violent transphobes, that is grave injustice. That is bullying. That is harassment. That is the unforgivable sin. Yet the very same people threatening others with rape, that's perfectly acceptable behaviour. That tells us all we need to know about their so-called anti-bullying stance. It holds as much water as their support for the trans community. They only give a damn on a symbolic level, a level they can profit from in some way. And that's it. So with those issues addressed and some basic things laid down for us to consider in going forward, it's important that the conversation return to what it's been about since the very start. The human rights of trans people and the lack of accountability in the secular community. Because this is not a topic that will disappear if ignored. Make no mistake, this will continue to fester unless dealt with in a just fashion, regardless of how various larger names in the secular community seek to bury it beneath active defamation. But by seeing what's actually occurred, by realizing how many of us are being played, we can begin to challenge that. To this day, Woodford stands with his calls to violence against trans people. What are we going to do about it?